Hey, what's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. My name is Jacob Restituto, and I'm a musician from Northport, New York. And today I have the pleasure of Al from Landr. We're going to be talking about mastering and all the different things leading up to mastering and inside of mastering. It is, to me personally, one of the most confusing parts of the music industry, and that's why I love using Landr. So we're going to be going a little bit more deep dive with Al today. So, Al, thank you for taking time to be on the channel, man.
No problem. Glad to be here.
So, as I mentioned in the intro, mastering can be a bit of a beast. And when I first started releasing and making music, I said, you know what? I'm writing the songs, I'm making the songs, producing the songs, I'm mixing the songs. I don't want to learn how to master. So I just started sending
Just
them out to people.
yeah.
And a little bit of my story is how I linked up with Landr was I was working with some guy in Nashville, sending in my tracks every time to master them. And, he'd always have to revise them a little bit, but the price, I release a lot of music, and the price continually, like, just a track after track after track
Yeah.
kept getting. You do 10 tracks. I was going trying to do like somewhere between a track a month. At one point, I was doing like a track a week. Somewhere where it adds up in price. So that's why I love Landr, because I could test things in between, or I master them in between, kind of get a feel for what the master is going to sound like, or master as much as many songs as I want. Sometimes I even master my acoustic covers that I'm going to put up on YouTube. I'm like, you know what? Why not?
Why not?
So that's how I got introduced to Landr, because I didn't want to learn how to master myself. And you guys, when I AB'd the professional Nashville studio to your work, it I liked Landr better, or they were comparable. So it's like, you know what? I've been using guys for probably at least 4 years now, 4 or 5 years.
Cool.
One of the early
Yeah.
adopters. Proud to say
Yeah.
it.
Exactly. You're a lifer.
A lifer, exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. So, can you give a little brief explanation as to what mastering actually is?
Yeah. I mean, the standard line is, mastering prepares your music for release, et cetera, et cetera. What exactly that means, though, is kind of different to everyone. Like for some people, it's sort of like a last stage QA, just to make sure everything's a-okay, and they don't expect a mastering engineer to do very much. For other people, it's like it is kind of synonymous with bus processing and take my song as far as it can go, like really do some heavy lifting.
Hmm.
And I want to say recent times, but it's been around for a long time. With the loudness wars, mastering is also making it loud. Like that's just a fact of what we do, and making it competitively loud is, it's not as easy to just slap a limiter on it and keep, and cranking it.
Mm-hmm.
So there are like tricks and things like that to how do you make it loud but still, don't totally, have it implode.
Exactly.
Um,
And I
so
think I've heard that a lot of compression, what it does, I mean, sorry, it's a lot. Also, let me rephrase it. A lot of
mhm.
mastering is a bit of adding a bit of compression, where like makes the quieter parts a little bit quiet, louder, the louder parts a little quieter. Kind of gives more of a cohesive. I've heard that people say that it's like that glue that you put on a paint, not a puzzle, after you're done, kind of making it all smooth together, all stick together, all even.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, like I said, if you've done that in the mix, if you've mixed into a compressor and everything is pretty well gelled, tasteful mastering
Sure.
won't add more. You don't cook a pizza twice, it's that kind of thing. But if you've sent something, and kind of getting your grips with mixing, and not everything is, you don't have like your full tool set's not up and running. If things are sticking out, if vocals are sticking out, if it just feels like, I can hear everything, but they're not really working together, compression can be a big part of that. All kinds of, you know, some of the more esoteric processes too can help that, like
Sure.
multi-band compression or dynamic EQ, things like that can just sort
So
of tighten things up in a way that just makes it more palatable to the listener.
yeah, that's fascinating. So let's take two roads then. Let's take the road of the relative beginner musician
Mm-hmm.
that that you mentioned, like things are kind of sticking out a little bit, and get best practices for mastering. And then let's also go more towards the, hey, I've been doing this for 10 years. I know generally what I'm doing. My mixes sound pretty good. what are some more advanced best practices to get it ready for mastering.
Yeah.
And then after that we can talk about like what like best practices inside of mastering, but let's talk pre-mastering for the beginner first.
Sure. I mean, I guess this would apply to literally anyone, no matter how long you've been doing it, but make your mix sound the best it possibly can. There are people, it sounds like a given that, just make your stuff sound good. But there are people that try and almost anticipate certain mastering processes. So they'll leave things maybe more dynamic than they should. Kicks and snares mixed a little bit too loud in anticipation of what the limiter is going to do. And while there's some logic in that, I think it's a better practice to just try and get everything sounding good. Monitor with a limiter if you need to. Please take it off the master bus before submitting for mastering. But by all means, like monitor with the limiter, and that's for something like Landr can be super useful, is checking your mix as you go to just hear what it's going to sound like being brought up to commercial levels. But then, yeah, I mean, just make it sound the best it can. Don't try to anticipate what mastering is going to do, because when you leave these things open, it ends up complicating the process.
Yeah.
One, it's like, is it intentional? Do you really want your kick and snare that loud? Should I be careful about pulling back on it? And then, overly dynamic things can be just as bad as underly dynamic things.
Sure.
Where, it just makes the limiter work harder than it needs to. And maybe doing it on the master bus is the wrong place to do it, when you could be controlling those individual elements in a way that's much more musical.
Yeah, that's
or at least has much less collateral damage on the other aspects of the mix.
Yeah. That's fascinating. So for those that aren't super familiar with all these musical terms, can you go just a little bit more in depth on what a limiter actually does and how it's different than a compressor?
Yeah. So a limiter, when we talk about a limiter, like, compression taken to the max ultimately is limiting, in a general sense. Once you get above like a 10-to-1 ratio, you're sort of talking about limiting and peak limiting. But limiters, when we say limiter, we usually mean brick wall limiter, look ahead brick wall limiter. And those are like kind of very specific dynamic processes that basically they're trying to knock down peaks so that nothing gets by. Like a compressor has attack times, things like that. Limiters, you don't want an attack time. You don't want anything getting by it. So it's trying to just basically shave off everything so you can bring up the body of the song without audible clipping. And it's trying to do that shaving in as transparent a way as possible. Yeah. Now, they are subject to the laws of physics. So there's limits, no pun intended, to like how much you can jack into a limiter. And they will distort at some point. You will get artifacts, things like that. But modern limiters can do some pretty incredible things, pretty transparently, certainly more transparently than your run-of-the-mill compressor trying to do the same stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So continuing along in the best practices for mastering, one of the industry standards that I've seen for a long, long time is keeping the mix pre-export, the peaks at around -6 to -3 dB. Can you elaborate on that and what you believe best practice is?
Yeah, I mean, that's a pretty good rule of thumb. The idea behind something like -6, -3, they're not magical numbers. It's not like, oh my God, I hit -2.8. Like the cops are going to show up or something.
My type A personality is like, it cannot go past negative. I usually like -6. Is there a difference between the two?
No, as long as downstream or upstream, however you want to think about the mix, basically the idea is that if you've gain staged everything properly throughout your mix, that's roughly where your peak should end up. If they're going way higher than that, then maybe you've got problems upstream, that you're just hitting things too hard. And I mean, what complicates things a little bit is that some plugins can handle whatever level you throw at them and they behave the same. So if you have
Sure.
like pure digital, everything's working floating point. If you don't know what floating point is, don't worry about that. It's just how DAWs work, and I don't even understand it 100%. But you got like almost infinite headroom at that point. And
Mm,
it doesn't matter if you're hitting that plug-in at -30, -3, plus 2000, sort of doesn't matter. But then a bunch of other plugins, if they're modeled on analog compressors, analog EQs, tape machines, saturators, all that kind of stuff, they're very sensitive to how hard you hit them.
mm-hmm.
So the input level will determine the amount of saturation, the amount of distortion.
Sure.
Like as you hit them harder, they're supposed to behave like their analog counterparts and give you more and more saturation. So if you're not really paying attention to your levels throughout the mix, you could be hitting these plugins way harder than you intend to, and it adds up to ultimately an oversaturated, kind of brittle, two-dimensional sounding mix.
Mm,
And the peaks that are hitting your master bus are sort of indicative of whether you're hitting things too hard all the way through or not. If you're gain staging properly all the way through your mix, then you should be coming out with around -6, -3, like really anything under 0, as long as there's no limiter on the master bus artificially keeping that red light from turning on, you're pretty safe. But if everything's kind of really pushing up against the limits,
yeah.
I'd sort of go back and look at how hard you're hitting all your effects chains.
So one of the questions I've always been curious about is, so if we're trying to keep it around -3, -6 dB,
Mm-hmm.
dB being decibels for the people for everybody watching,
Yeah.
if you have a whole mix, say it's -2, and you want to get it to -4, right? Can you just lower the master fader down
Oh,
-2 dB?
like, you know what? Yes, ultimately, yes,
What was
because
the
of
sigh for? You gotta elaborate. You gotta elaborate.
it's like you can do that, but it doesn't fix if the problem is your gain staging. That doesn't fix anything. If your problem is clipping the master bus, theoretically, yes, pulling down the master bus fader will actually get rid of the clipping. But you know, it's sort of like in for a penny, in for a pound, you know, or like a job worth doing is worth doing well.
Exactly.
Might as well go back and fix it at the source, which
Now,
is
hypothetically,
probably going to be in your, you know, pulling down individual tracks a little bit, individual buses, stuff
what
like
if
that.
you, instead of doing the master, you selected everything? Because say like, so the question that the problem that I typically run into is like, hey, I like the way this sounds. It's just too loud. You know what
Yeah.
I mean? So could you hypothetically then go and select all the faders and all the buses and lower them 2 dB or 3 dB? Would that?
The problem with that is if you're lowering individual channels that are then going to hit a compressor on a bus, you're going to change the amount of compression
Sure.
you're getting. So any sort of dynamically dependent processes like compressors, or saturators or anything like that you're using purposefully for that effect, changing the levels going into those, you're going to change the behavior.
Yeah.
So maybe that's not what you want to do.
Yeah.
But let's say you've got everything going into a bunch of buses, and then those buses are just going straight to your master bus. Pulling down the individual buses will fix the problem.
Yeah.
You just have to kind of be aware of the chain of processing and what is happening where, like your basic signal flow throughout your entire mix.
Yeah.
And just make sure that if you're pulling down levels, it's not going to have some knock-on effect that is or that you're not accounting for.
Yeah.
So yeah, mixing's complicated. Sorry, everyone.
For sure, for sure.
Yeah.
Can you go a little bit more in depth into the gain staging? So that's a pretty common term, but I'd love to
Yeah.
hear your take on how you think gain staging can best serve for getting ready to master with Landr.
Yeah, gain staging properly. I mean, it's part of making sure that everything you're doing in a mix is intentional. You know, if we go back to the old days, they were essentially the old days. They were fighting noise floor and headroom. And that was the whole kind of mindset behind gain staging is you need to keep things loud enough that you're not going to have it disappear into the noise floor, but you essentially ran into headroom problems at the top where you kind of start clipping and going into saturation,
Yeah.
and ultimately you just flat out distort. We don't really have noise floor problems in digital anymore. That at least digital got rid of that. And like I mentioned, if you keep things completely digital with no modeling plugins or anything, you kind of also don't have headroom problems, in which case, I don't know, do whatever you want. But there's no harm in following gain staging practices there. You're not going to like lose bits or any of those kinds of not 100% true theories. But the thing is, as soon as you put one of those plugins in, like a tape machine or a compressor that models distortion, anything like that, it really does matter how hard you hit it. Mm-hmm. So the idea of gain staging is one, just to take something off your plate. So you're not always thinking like, oh, does this plugin model analog? It kind of doesn't matter. Just go in with conservative levels and you'll be fine no matter what is what processor is downstream. And, you know, it's sort of settling on a standard where something like minus 18 dBFS is sort of a good average to keep your individual tracks. And that's an average level. So it's not like you need to peak at minus 18 dBFS. It's more like generally that's where the level should sit. Obviously, tambourines are going to be different than organs because they have a very different envelope. But it's just a good idea to go through all your tracks, especially if you're using samples, which tend to be like, they come in really hot. Just pulling things down, and it's as simple as you could either select everything and just normalize it to a value, you know, play around. I'll like peak normalize to minus 10 just to get started, and then I'll start adjusting individual levels as I see how hard things are hitting. You know, you'll also, nothing says you can't take individual tracks and run them hot into these saturation and clipping plugins for an aesthetic effect.
Sure.
You know, it's not against the law to overload them. It's more that you're aware at every stage what your plugins are doing, even if it's not something that's controlled by a knob, you know, if it's just some sort of behind the scenes kind of processing.
So do you like gain staging with like using like an actual gain plugin and setting it to negative 18, or do you like kind of monitoring it so that they all relatively stay around negative 18?
I like gaining stuff at the beginning. So you could either do it with a plugin, you know, every DAW has multiple ways of doing this.
Sure.
You could either do it with a plugin as your first plugin in your chain. You could do it with like clip gain right on the actual waveform itself. Just be aware of if you're doing automation or anything like that, is it happening pre-effects chain or post-effects chain? So if you're just automating a fader, usually that happens post-effects. So you have to be careful. That's not going to change the level going into all your processors.
That's a good point.
Yeah. So I'll usually do clip gain on the actual waveforms. And then I have a gain plugin at the end of my chain, just because I like to do a ton of automation. So it helps me like do sort of coarse level changes without having to mess with my automation. It's just easier for my little brain to think about.
These are some good tips. So to recap, and let's go into to once you're in Landr and you're mastering inside of Landr. But to recap, keeping it relatively in -3 to -6 dB, but the easiest way to do that is to relatively gain stage beforehand and monitor your levels beforehand rather than just dropping it at the end.
Yeah, I mean, we you know, I've definitely gotten things where it's like just this insane brick wall that is perfectly at -6. You know, that's not the way this is supposed to work out. You've essentially burnt the pizza, you know, and just dropping it by 6 dB is
exactly, and then they're asking you to continue cooking the pizza. The pizza.
That's it. It's like it's nothing's going to change at that point.
That's funny. That's really funny. I've also heard that leaving the room that -3 to -6 leaves you guys headroom to like to actually master it and to raise the volume or limit it or compress it or equalize it, right?
Yeah, like that's a really good point, because I think it's a little bit misunderstood. Ultimately, like if you're not jamming into a limiter, if the limiter is not doing a lot of processing, I mean, I can always gain things down if I need more headroom. It's a very
Mm.
transparent process. So it's not like, it's not a huge deal if your peaks are up around 0 or down at -8, kind of, as long as they're not having any process applied to them just to keep them in check, that's
Mm.
fine. Mastering
That's
can take
fascinating.
care of that. But, and I have no science to back this up, but experientially, over the however many tracks I've mastered, when something has hit a limiter really hard, if I'm trying to do anything to it, the collateral damage of any subsequent effects is like greatly amplified compared to if I'm working on an unlimited track and then I limit it up to that level.
Mm-hmm.
So what that means is if you send a track that's just brick walled, and all you need to do is like a light shelf on the EQ because it's a little bit too bright, the amount of damage that doing that process is going to do makes it not worth it, because every effect has some sort of consequence to it. You do EQ, you're going to get a bit of phase shift, you're going to get a little bit of you're going to change the waveform slightly, so it's going to become louder and hit. You have to put another limiter, even if this thing is limited. Any processing you do, you have to put another limiter on it, and all that kind of stuff. And that's going to have, the negative effects of that is going to be much greater than if you just work with a dynamic track to begin with and then do the final stage of limiting it
Yeah.
back up. Again, it's
That,
like baking a pizza twice.
it's
It's
so
going to be,
fascinating, man. It's so techy too. There's so many different aspects too. It's
it
amazing.
is. I mean, ultimately, the breakdown is techie. The way you think about it is kind of techie, but the result is that your track is going to lose punch.
Sure.
Your center image is going to get smeared. The presentation of your music is going to be compromised. So the knock-on effect is that your music sounds worse.
Yeah.
So why do it? Like, if nothing's to be gained, why do it?
Exactly. No pun intended.
Yeah.
You
Yeah, exactly.
know.
There's so
so,
many limiter and gain puns when you're talking about music.
so
Yeah.
continuing on into now we're bouncing and we're exporting it outside of Logic or wherever you mix. It has -6, -3 to 6 dB. There's no smashing the limiter and then just lowering the
Yeah.
volume. Now we're getting into Landr. Can you
Mhm.
explain in like a 30-second, because we've talked about Landr a couple times on the channel here before, but can you give just a 30-second little overview as to what Landr is and how it works? The
Yeah.
mastering, because I know you guys, Landr has actually a whole bunch of stuff that it's doing now,
Yeah,
but
yeah,
just
for
the last
sure.
mastering part of it.
The mastering part. So the most important thing that happens is when you upload your track, we analyze it based on genre. And that's our proprietary definitions that we've worked over time as to, we've come up with our own interpretations of what constitutes a genre. And that's
That's fascinating.
essential because that tells the engine how to essentially analyze, how to listen to your track. Because if it's analyzing just, basic frequency balance, things like that, those things mean different things in different genres. So context is essential. If I'm mastering a track and I sit down, it doesn't matter to me if two tracks have the exact same frequency balance. If one of them is a trap song, that frequency balance might be perfect and not need a whole lot of work. To a rock song, that might be wildly out of whack, and I need to, roll up the sleeves, get my hands dirty.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of the same thing, where the first step is understanding what this song wants to be, essentially, without getting too poetic about it. And then, with that understanding, with that context, we'll analyze the track, without giving away the farm,
Sure, yeah.
kind of understand what it's looking at. So, basic things, frequency, loudness, dynamics, whether certain frequency anomalies are persistent throughout a track or just happen here and there. uh,
And then it
it's
adjusts
listening to it.
accordingly.
Yeah, exactly. It's listening to it like a person would listen to it, and trying to understand, is this intentional or does it need to be fixed?
Yeah.
And that's kind of the key. And then it will do as much or as little as it needs to do to get to what is, basically what is a good representation of that genre.
Mm-hmm. So let me ask you this, because there's a couple settings within Landr, and then they
Mm-hmm.
also just updated, which actually I found out 30 seconds ago, and I was like kind of poking around the site, is the revision section of the site. But before we even
Yeah.
get into that, when you upload to Landr, they have the I believe it's hard, medium, and soft mastering, right? And there's open, warm, and some
Balanced.
balanced
Yeah.
mixing. So I'm curious, do you find that there is better settings for different genres? Like the settings, or within, does it already master to the genre and then you just choose within those settings? So for example, if I'm making
Yeah.
pop music, do you recommend this over this, or is it just complete preference?
No, it's already done that. So
Okay.
that happens. The genre stuff happens behind the
Okay.
scenes. Like I said, it's a proprietary way of us
Sure.
understanding the genre. And then things like the warm, balanced, open, and then further with that, with revisions, like this ultimately still is a subjective field,
Hmm.
and one person's warmth is another person's mud. And there's no real
It's no,
accounting for
you
that.
broke up for a sec. One
Oh,
person's
sorry,
warmth is another person's.
mud.
Oh yeah, interesting.
Like two people might listen to the exact same master, and one thinks it's fantastic, the other person, it's not quite what I want.
Yeah.
So there still needs to be some accounting for individual taste,
Yeah.
and that's basically what we allow in a more of a coarse way with these aesthetics, the mastering styles. So that when you're choosing one of those, like a bunch of things are changing
Yeah.
in order to kind of bring about that aesthetic. So that would almost be like having a conversation with the mastering engineer ahead of time, like, oh, I really like this sound, I really like this style, that kind of thing. And then revisions is on the back end. Once
Yeah.
you get your master back, if everything is great, but you're like, oh, I wish the vocals stuck out a little bit more, or I wish this kick was pushed back a little bit more, we let you do that.
That is
Um,
wild.
so
It's so fascinating that that is actually like how that works. Because I like that. How new is that? Because I had never really seen that
pretty
before.
new. It's a couple of months, I think, that it's
Okay,
been
then
out.
I guess yeah, I just must have missed that one.
Yeah.
But that yeah, that's amazing. Because like that's very reminiscent. You know, it's almost a double edged sword though, because it's like almost like if you're familiar with like the problems of using a guitar modeler. It's like if you have a guitar amp, like you have one setting. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it's like
Yeah.
when you have a guitar modeler, you have 77 settings that you can continually mess with. And it's almost like that's why I loved Landr, because it's like, okay, I had three settings. I couldn't shoot, now I'm like, do I want the kick louder? Do I not want the kick
Yeah, that's
louder?
it.
but
Yeah.
when you do know those things that you do want or don't want, because there have been times where I'm like, shoot, this sounds really great, but I wished my vocals were a little louder. And I would typically sometimes just go back in the mix and adjust that. But to do that from the mastering standpoint, where I just click that little button, that's fascinating, man. I'm gonna have to mess with some of that stuff.
Yeah, for sure. And and a good approach would be like listen to the final master and kind of be like, okay, what do I actually want to change about this, rather than getting lost in the options. And
Yeah.
although for sure the first couple of times, please do get lost and
Yeah.
kind of explore them all, because it's
Yeah.
pretty cool. There's quite a lot in there.
Yeah.
Um,
I was pretty impressed with. I mean, even things from like the syllabus reduction, like for certain like syllabus, meaning like the s's or the right, the t's, the hard
yeah.
syllabus is like that's fascinating, man, because that's something that is hard to mix out. Like at least for myself, like it's always a struggle finding that balance between brightness of a track and also taking out the syllabuses, because it's interesting.
Yeah, for sure. It goes everything from like more of a general EQ approach to like really specific,
Yeah.
like, okay, this thing's bothering me a little bit. So,
Yeah.
it's kind of the analogy we used was, do you want the bus to drop you off near your house or right in front of your house? And
Yeah.
like basically you want to get as close to your house as possible.
Exactly.
So that's the idea of this, just taking it that extra little bit.
Absolutely. So in wrapping it up, I'm curious for your perspective, somebody that's worked with a lot of different mixes and stuff.
Yeah.
What do you see as a top notch mix? What's your standard that you're like? I was speaking with another musician personally, actually, to give a little backstory, and he said, he's made a couple of hits that won Grammys and stuff, and I was like, well, what makes a Grammy hit? And he's like, well, first of all, you need to hit this floor. You have to be above this floor level, and
Yeah.
anything of that after that is kind of subjective. I'm curious what your floor level is, like everything, and then everything else up to that is subjective.
That's really interesting because that's exactly how I see it. I feel like at the beginning, there is definitely a linear progression of getting better. You actually get objectively better as you go. And then at a certain point, you've got like your tool sets, you know how to hear things critically, you understand what to do with them when you hear those problems. From there, it's just like, it's only lateral movement, right? It's just like, I like things dirty. I like things clean. Neither one is better or worse because you've got that foundation. It's exactly that. It's that floor. You do have to get to that level. I'm not advocating for complete relativism, but once you're past that, it really is, there's as many different ways of producing a really good mix as there are engineers out there to do it.
Yeah.
So, at the beginning, learning how to hear is essential, and that plays into like your monitoring and stuff like that. And, you don't have to buy, $10,000 monitors. Like good headphones can get you a long way. A lot of it is the brain and your ears and training yourself, like to hear.
So if you could give one tip,
you can't fix it if you can't hear it.
Yeah, how would if you could give one tip, how would you recommend improving your ears?
Lots and lots of listening. I mean, listening to mixes you really like. A lot of exercises, things like what does overcompression sound like? What does play around with attack times and things like that. And
yeah, that's.
I mean,
good.
I wish I could say like, oh, do X, Y, Z, and you're done. But it's more like do A through Z and then 1 through like there's so many little things you'll need to do. But it's just listening over time. When I first started and people were talking about like, oh, 0.5 dB of EQ, I'm like, get out of here, man. 0.5 dB, like no way you're hearing that. And then ultimately you get to the point where you're like, oh yeah, I hear. So now I'm the obnoxious guy where I'm like, oh, it's like 0.5 dB.
Dude, when I'm taking notes on my mixes, like, so every musician does the car mix. You mix in your studio with the monitors and the headphones, and then you take it to your car. It's like, how's it sound in the car? I'm like always I'm always on my phone, be like, oh, I need like 0.3 dB less on that cymbal. And I'm like, you're right. You kind of get a feel for what these slight dB movements are. Compared to when you're starting, you're like, oh, I need 19 dB here and 14 dB here.
That's it, and it's like, a lot of people are like, oh, it doesn't matter. And I guess ultimately, like, if your song's a hit, it'll be a hit whether the hi-hat is like a dB louder or quieter.
Yeah.
But when you're trying to get everything together, these little shifts add up cumulatively to something that feels balanced or doesn't.
Yeah.
And that actually is important if you're trying to, like, so much of this is expression. It's we talk about people need to like it, people need to listen to it, the audience. You also have to be confident in what you're putting out into the world. So having a good sense of like, yeah, I think this sounds great.
Yeah.
That's ultimately that's where you need to be.
Yeah.
Bring it full circle back to the beginning of our conversation. Make your mix sound as good as it possibly can to you.
Yeah.
And if you're confident in it, the world will let you know whether you're right or not.
Exactly, man. Absolutely. Well, I really appreciate your insights, man. I think you had some really, really good things, and we definitely went in depth on this. So I want to say, if you could hang out for 2 seconds, I want to say thank you to everybody that has watched this, has made it this far in the video. You guys are the true ones. Appreciate you guys. Definitely check out Landr. I recommend them. Like I said in the beginning of this conversation, I've been using them for years to master my music, and I release a lot of music. So the majority of the music that I've released has been mastered through Landr. So go check that out. If you want to check out my music, it's the best way to support the channel. And you check out the Instagram and subscribing here. So I'll see you guys in the next video. Have a great day. God bless and peace out.